As the holidays come around once more, I figured I'd write a letter to see if I get what I asked for. I grabbed my stationery and away I wrote, hoping that Jingle would read this note. I wrote the best letter possible to get a good score, although it looked crazy and was quite a chore. There's a method to this madness, I promise there's a plan. Time to wait and see for Pete the Mailman. In the spirit of the holidays, I figured today we'd finally talk about how letters work in the original Animal Crossing. In this game, you can freely send letters to any of your resident villagers, and they will respond in various ways, almost as if they can actually read what you wrote. For example, if you send a letter full of nonsensical letter spam, they will reply back completely confused and insulted. But as long as you structure a letter coherently, they'll usually respond more favorably and might even include a gift. So how does this all work? How do villagers read the letters you send to them? Whenever you send a letter off to a villager, there are 7 checks that occur based on the contents of the letter. These checks either add or subtract hidden points, which internally score your letter to elicit an appropriate response. First, the game checks for capital letters and proper punctuation. This is accomplished by looking at every period, question mark, or exclamation point and checking the next 3 spaces to see if a capital letter occurs. If there is a capital letter within 3 spaces of a punctuation mark, the game awards plus 10 points per occurrence. If there isn't, the game subtracts minus 10 points per occurrence. Further, the end of the letter is also checked to ensure it ends with a period, question mark, or exclamation point. Ending your letter with punctuation gets you plus 20 points. Next, the game checks the beginning of each word for some common trigrams in the English language. A trigram is just a fancy word for a string of 3 characters, and the game has an entire reference table dedicated to these trigrams. The idea here is that the game wants to make sure that you're writing real words, but it's not really feasible to check every word you write and see if it actually exists. So instead, they use these tables of trigrams and cross-reference them with the beginning of each word to cover their bases. If a word starts with any of these common trigrams, the game will interpret it as valid and increment a counter. At the end of the letter, the total number of proper trigrams that were detected is multiplied by 3 and then added to your letter's total score. The next check simply looks for the first non-space character in the letter to see if it's capital. If your letter starts with a capital, you get plus 20 points, and if not, minus 10 points. Continuing on, the game also scans the letter in search of repeated characters. If any letter of the alphabet is repeated 3 times or more, the game will instantly deduct 50 points and move on to the next check. Here, the game looks at the ratio of space characters to non-space characters. The calculation here is the total number of spaces times 100 divided by the total number of non-spaces. If this number is less than 20, the game will deduct minus 20 points. Otherwise, the game will add 20 points. You might think you can trick the game to divide by 0 here if you just fill a letter with spaces, or in other words, include 0 non-space characters. But there's an additional condition where if the letter is full of spaces, the game will just instantly deduct minus 20 points. Moving on, the game also checks if the letter is more than 75 characters long, and if it is, it looks for a punctuation mark within those 75 characters. If there isn't one, the game deducts a whopping 150 points from your letter. In other words, you must include a punctuation mark within the first 75 characters of your letter to not get completely destroyed by a 150 point penalty. Finally, the last check simply delimits the letter into 32 character groupings, looking for at least 1 space per group. The game will deduct minus 20 points per group that does not have a space, so don't ever plan to talk about numino-ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis because you'll run into a minus 20 point penalty for even writing that word. Anyways, those are all of the rules and checks that occur when you send a letter. If, at the end of all this, your letter has 100 points or more, you'll get a nice reply from a villager. But if your letter scored less than 50 points, you'll get a confused or bad reply. These letters also affect your friendship with villagers. Sending a good letter increases your friendship points with the villager by 3, while sending a bad letter will decrease it by 1. However, if you attach a present to your letter, you can get an additional boost of 3 friendship points. So you can still send a bad letter with a present attached to still net positive friendship. Now, with all of these letter systems explained, You might be wondering what the theoretical best and worst letters look like in this game. I consulted with Kyler, who was kind enough to make a mod that displays the letter points for us in real time as we write. A letter's body can have 192 characters total, and following the in-game rules, the highest theoretical score I could achieve was with this letter here, which scored a whopping 936 points. You might notice that I include no real words or trigrams here, and yet I still get a high score. It turns out, just spamming a capital letter followed by a period over and over is more efficient than actually writing real words and trying to score off trigrams anyway. This is because the game gives plus 10 points per capital letter after a punctuation mark. If we use proper trigrams, we would lose space to include capital letters and punctuations, and the score of trigrams does not outweigh the loss of space. While you can just spam a capital letter and a period, it is still worth it to include at least one space every 32 characters in order to avoid a 120 point penalty from the final check. In this case, we start our text with a capital letter, so that's plus 20 points. We also end the letter with a period, so that's another plus 20 points. We then have 92 occurrences of a capital letter following a punctuation mark, so that's an additional 10 points per occurrence, netting us plus 920 points. Finally, less than 20% of our letter includes spaces, so we do incur a 20-point penalty. But this loss is worth it and is mitigated by using the extra space to add more plus 10 capital letters. Also, even though we end the letter with a period, we also lose minus 10 points here because there is no capital letter following it. Doing the math, we end up with a 930-point letter. But wait, how come our in-game counter says 936 points? It turns out, hidden within this letter, we actually have 2 valid trigrams that net us 6 extra points. So, while the highest score I could find was 936, a theoretical higher score could possibly exist because the trigram tables are extremely bugged. This is because the game checks for valid trigrams by cycling through each letter's list until it comes across a stop character that tells the game to stop checking. The only problem is that when porting this game to North America and updating this letter system to English, the developers forgot to include the proper stop characters in their trigram lists. This means that every time the game tries to look up a proper trigram, it will look through its included array of valid ones, but if none are found, instead of returning at the end of the array, the check just blows past the array boundaries and starts referencing bytes in RAM. This is a really egregious bug since the game is technically reading into invalid territory every time it fails to find a matching trigram. Luckily, this will probably never crash the game because there are millions of bytes in RAM that follow this letter check system. This means that the check will eventually find a random stop character in RAM and finally return. So, while the highest score I could find was 936, there could theoretically be a higher score if you know the RAM values and the lookup tables to abuse this bug and include bugged trigrams. In terms of the worst scoring letter possible, I believe that reward belongs to this letter here. This letter scores negative 670 points by starting with 3 repeating non-capital characters, including no trigrams, and continuing with a pattern of lowercase letters following punctuation. It is funny how the highest scoring letter and the lowest scoring letters both look quite similar, but just a few little nuances turn the tides of scoring. So if you're planning on writing a letter to Santa this year, now you know the best way to please him and get a gift in return. Anyways, I hope each and every one of you have a great holiday season and enjoy yourselves with friends and family. Big shout out to James Chambers and Kyler for decompiling, documenting, and assisting me on this video. And a very warm thank you to all of my Patreon and YouTube members for supporting the channel this year, including Lunascape, Cynthia, Dylan Trudeau, Cass, Hornet, Silly Marina, Villager, Japan Eat, Tammy's Head, Tarumi, Vinny Diddy, Pidge01, Kai D, Comfy Boy 404, Zip, Bobby Nard, Holly Molly, Exploding Bears, Idrin, Sitz, Clifford Longhead, Comfy, Tenchi Prime, Goose Fart, Moggery, Puff, and Cray.